Hey guys, it's Samantha, and today I wanted to make a video about one of my biggest professional grievances as a teen librarian, and I think it's also appropriate as sort of a continuation of the discussion and a response to Daniel Greene's YA fantasy problem videos that he just posted. I think he does make some valid points, and there's a lot of things I agree with him about, but I think there's also some places where he missed the mark just because he isn't as immersed in the YA field as someone like myself is, and I thought it would be really interesting to kind of talk about my personal and professional issues with what is going on with YA fantasy. So before I get into this video, I think it's really important to sort of define what middle grade and YA are. So middle grade is sort of seen as books that are for grade school children. We kind of get that ages 8 to 12, maybe 13. There's a little bit of overlap between middle grade and YA. Think books like Rick Riordan and Harry Potter. And then we have YA, which was intended for this 12 to 18 age demographic that sort of speaks to authentic teen experiences, perhaps navigating first love, figuring out what you want to do in life. Where do I want to go to college? Do I want to go to college? What's important to me? Separating yourself from your family, that sort of thing. So it is almost impossible to talk about YA without talking about the influence of Harry Potter and Twilight. And I think neglecting to talk about Twilight was one of the biggest issues in Daniel Greene's videos. Something that's important to note when it comes to YA fantasy is that the readership is primarily women. And there is a reason for that. We have trained women to look for their fantasy books in the YA section. So let's go back to the beginning. Harry Potter is the book series that made it acceptable for adults to read children's stories. So that isn't to say that adults didn't read books aloud to their children or didn't read a book like that in tandem with their child, but Harry Potter was sort of this big publishing trend that made it okay, socially acceptable for an adult to be seen carrying around and reading a children's book. After the success of Harry Potter, I think adults were more willing to pick up the books that their children and teenagers were reading and raving about, and this sort of led to the Twilight craze. So Twilight was hugely popular among middle and high school girls and their mothers, and I think that's a really important thing to note. Like I said, YA fantasy is primarily consumed by women. So women were reading Twilight and loving Twilight and then returning to the section where they found Twilight to find their next great read. Even now, almost 15 years past the Twilight craze, I still get so many adult women who are 10, 15 years older than me, that come up to the teen section at the library and say, I loved Twilight, I want to get back into reading. What should I read next? And that is still sort of this benchmark that a lot of adult women who maybe aren't as immersed in the reading culture, they don't know where to start, and Twilight is their benchmark. So I think it's really important to consider that Twilight had a major impact on the readership of YA fantasy. So not only was there a larger adult audience reading YA fantasy, I think the most important thing is there was a larger adult audience buying YA fantasy, and they were buying it for themselves. Adults hold more spending power than teenagers. That's just a fact. They have more disposable income. So since adults have discovered that these fantasy books written by and for women exist, and that they exist in the YA sort of marketing subset, they are continuing to return to YA to find those books written by women that they aren't seeing in the adult section. Adult fantasy has been historically written by white men, and this is something that is changing but has not been as quick to change as it has been in YA. YA as a whole is very adaptive to trends and changes in interest because teens are very quick to change their interests. So YA has to be very quick to change and adapt. It isn't a slow-moving machine like adult publishing is. So there's definitely been a shift in the past few years. There are more adult, female, and diverse authors being published as adult. Obviously, we have N.K. Jemisin, we have Erin Morgenstern, Naomi Novak, V. Schwab, we have books like The Poppy War, The Priory of the Orange Tree. the Devabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. So there are clearly books that are starting to come out within the last few years that are meeting this demand for female-written and female-centric fantasy within the adult fantasy community. But over the past 5 to 10 years, and still going forward until there's a more equitable distribution of fantasy within the adult realm, YA fantasy has been a stopgap for diverse and female-written fantasy within the genre. I think it's impossible to have this discussion without talking about the innate sexism in fantasy publishing. I hear time and time again from female fantasy writers that they are being encouraged to change their manuscripts or remarket their manuscripts as YA instead of adult because the female fantasy readership is still turning to YA for their books. We've almost been trained as women to look for female-centric fantasy in YA. Adding to this, there is sort of this belief that any book written by a woman that is fantasy is YA, except for maybe N.K. Jemisin and Robin Hobb. I can't tell you how many times I have had discussions online, which that might be my first problem, had discussions online about fantasy books and have been told that books like The Poppy War is YA, that The Night Circus is YA, that Naomi Novak is YA. Even in comment section of Daniel's video, people were talking about how Spinning Silver is a YA book when it's clearly not. There really seems to be this innate belief that books that are written by and for women must be YA. I think it's important here to note that age of character is not the only thing that defines whether something is YA or adult. There are plenty of series with young protagonists like Mistborn or Eye of the World that have very young protagonists, teenage protagonists, but they are considered adult fantasy. Books that have the sort of classic hero's journey arc and start with a young teenage or very young adult protagonist are seen as adult fantasy when they're written by male authors, but a lot of times when a book features a 19 or 20-year-old female protagonist going through a similar hero's journey and it's written by a woman, they are sort of seen and relegated as YA, even if the tone of writing that is used and the content in that book is considered adult. And then, of course, if we're having this conversation about what is acceptable in adult versus YA fantasy, we have to talk about the Sarah J Maas problem. This is another huge trend that Daniel didn't touch on, and I think that was a big mistake. Sarah J Maas has been hugely influential in what is allowed in YA fantasy, and also has been a huge confounding factor in what is adult, what is YA. She definitely blurred the lines in a big way. The contents in ACOTAR are in no way appropriate for traditional YA fantasy or YA books in general. While sex in YA books is okay, a lot of times it's what I consider to be fade to black sex or primetime TV sex, where you sort of get an idea of what's going on, but you're not getting an explicit description of what body parts are going where. It's not a play-by-play. You get a general sense that they are having sex. Maybe there's some euphemism for an orgasm, but it's not a hugely descriptive scene. And anyone who's read ACOTAR and the following books will tell you that it's very explicit sex written on par with adult erotic novels. At my library, we actually had to move ACOTAR because it was published and marketed as a YA book. And so the people doing the buying and the cataloging assumed it was a YA book and that it was appropriate for teens. And then someone at the library actually read it, and we ended up moving it to adult because the content just isn't appropriate for teens. But of course, because it was originally marketed as YA, people returned to YA looking for read-alikes, similar to what happened with Twilight. So now we're seeing this YA fantasy that's really pushing boundaries, that's targeted at more of an 18 to 25-year-old audience, that isn't being marketed as new adult because new adult sort of carries this baggage of being seen as erotica and as porn. So this sort of leads to what is one of my biggest professional issues with the state of YA fantasy publishing, and that is that these books are pushing teens out of YA. These are books that are clearly meant to be consumed by adult women, and that they have content that is not necessarily appropriate to recommend to the 12 to 16, 17-year-old age range, which is a huge part of the readership. And you know, part of this is being covered by the aging up of middle grade. Middle grade used to have a pretty firm boundary of ending at like 6th grade-ish, and I'm seeing more and more middle grade books that have characters in 7th, 8th, even 9th grade. And so that is kind of picking up this gap of younger teenagers who maybe aren't ready to read explicit sexual content for their own comfort or because their parents don't want them to read it. But I also run into this issue where kids are very eager to grow up when they become teenagers, and middle grade books are sort of seen as books for babies or books for their younger siblings, and they are so ready to be in the teen section at the library because they are 13, they're in middle school, they want to read those teen books. It's very frustrating that all of the hyped and big marketed titles are books that just aren't appropriate for a teenage audience or for the younger side of a teenage audience. YA emerged in the 50s and 60s as sort of this response to this growing teenage experience. For a very long time, people were either children or they were adults, and there wasn't a whole lot of in between. So someone who was 18 and graduated from high school was seen as an adult, and they were working, they were buying a house, they were getting married, they were having children, and there wasn't this sort of teenage or emerging adulthood age demographic the way we see it today. Now we view teens as a very distinct age demographic, and I would argue that we're seeing a new shift and sort of the rise of the emerging adult. So I will leave a link down below for an article on sort of what defines emerging adulthood, but this is a trend that I don't think is going to go away. College has become the new high school and grad school has become the new college. People are living at home longer than ever because of how unaffordable housing is in many areas of the country. So people are living with their parents into their 20s. They're delaying having children, they're delaying getting married, and education is continuing into the mid to late 20s. So it's natural that this kind of new age demographic would want books that speak to their experiences. And quite frankly, a lot of their experiences, especially when it comes to things like identity and figuring out what they want to do with their life, and maybe they're still living at home and dealing with their family's expectations of them, and maybe their parents are controlling. A lot of those issues are going to be found more in YA books than they are in traditional adult books. However, that same demographic, that 18 to 25-year-old, is probably, you know, having sex, having more serious romantic relationships. They might be drinking or doing recreational drugs, or they have friends that have drug problems. That kind of stuff has become more acceptable in YA because I think that emerging adulthood readership has been continuing to turn back to YA since they see themselves more in those YA books and they see more in common with a high school senior than maybe they do with a 35-year-old character in a lit fit book. Now, my biggest issue as a reader of fantasy is, like I said, the lack of female and diverse voices in adult fantasy. This is a problem that I really do think is course correcting, and I really think that in 10 years this is going to be a moot point. This is a problem that we are seeing changing as we speak. I do also think we are seeing a shift in readership in YA spaces where I am discussing YA books with other adults. I'm seeing sort of this acknowledgement of this new wave of female written fantasy that is coming out. People who are traditionally YA readers or who have stuck to YA because that's where they've been able to find female-centered fantasy are starting to discover books like The Priory of the Orange Tree or Erin Morgenstern or Naomi Novak. These are people who felt pushed out of adult fantasy even 5 years ago and now are discovering so many diverse female voices within the adult fantasy publishing sector. However, I think we are still going to see this boom in YA fantasy that is not really intended for teens but is meant for an adult readership until we sort of get this balancing out in the adult market in terms of female-centered fantasy. Right now, the easiest way to find fantasy written by and for women is to browse your YA section. Yes, there are books coming out this year in the adult section written by female or diverse voices, but there's nowhere near the volume. If you're a voracious fantasy reader, I read about 240 books a year. Not all of them are fantasy, but the vast majority of them are. You are going to run out of books very, very quickly. And as much as I love classic fantasy, and some of my favorite books are books written by men, this isn't meant to be a let's hate on male fantasy or that men can't write authentic, well-written female characters. Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson is one of my favorite books of all time. I do think that the issue is that women also want to read female characters written by women. Something that just made me feel like Daniel didn't really get the problem was that he didn't talk about the fact that so much of the YA fantasy readership is female, that it's a primarily female readership, and also that when he suggested if you were looking for a strong female voice in adult fantasy, read a book written by a man, it just felt like it missed the mark. I don't think Daniel was intentionally trying to come across as sexist, nor do I think Daniel is sexist in any way, shape, or form, but it sort of misses the mark that women want to read books by women. Quite frankly, I bet there's men that want to read books by women. I think the more diverse voices you have in a publishing genre, you're going to push to have better and more unique content. YA is just the easiest place if you're looking for books set in diverse settings, written by own voices authors, or books written by and for women. You don't have to spend hours researching, trying to find good books once you get past like the first few obvious choices in adult fantasy. So like I said, overall, I think this is a problem that is going to eventually course correct as we do start to see more and more female written fantasy published in the adult space. I also think that we are going to see an emergence of something that is akin to like the new adult in concept, but is seen sort of this bridging genre between YA and adult fantasy, whether YA is sort of split into like a younger teen and older teen, or some marketing genius somewhere comes up with a new term, since like I said, new adult has sort of been co-opted by erotic romance books. I think we are going to see a big change in how publishing markets books. Just like YA didn't exist 50 years ago, we're going to see the marketing of these books change to fit how we're living our lives now. And most of us are living our lives in a way that we're not like real adults until we're in our mid to late 20s. I think we're just in a place right now where there's a lot of growing pains in publishing and a lot of big shifts in publishing. And like I said, I really do think some of these problems will course correct on their own. Hopefully in 10 years, everything I'm saying is completely irrelevant. This is going to be a problem that isn't going to be fixed overnight, but I do think that publishing is moving in the direction of having more diverse voices in adult. Adult is finally catching up to the level of diversity that YA has had in it for the last 5 to 10 years. So I'm really optimistic that this isn't going to be a forever problem, that this is something that's going to change, that as a reader, I'm going to be able to find more and more awesome adult fantasy written by women. And quite frankly, I mean, that's what I'm desiring. I'm burning out on YA fantasy. There's only so much I can suspend my disbelief that the characters in a book are 17 and not 30, since so many books have aged down characters so that they can market it as YA because it's a female-centered fantasy. It's exhausting. I want to read books written for adults, by adults, but I also really care about reading female protagonists written by women and diverse characters. Alright guys, so that is everything from me. I really hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. I am very, very passionate about this subject. I love talking about trends in YA and YA readership. This is what I spend all of my day reading about and talking about and learning about. There's a whole video I could do just talking about trends in YA fantasy, and yes, some of that is driven by this sort of push for an adult readership in YA. So I hope that this video gave you something to think about. I would love to hear your comments down below. Please just keep it respectful, and I will see you guys soon with another video. Bye guys.